Hello and welcome to the She Needs podcast, a podcast about women flourishing in the church. Alongside my co-host Dave Bish, we'll be interviewing some of the authors that I've so appreciated and learnt from over the years. In writing this book, I wanted to do two things. Firstly, diagnose a problem in the church, and secondly, help others to feel it. I didn't want to, and so haven't offered solutions. That, I hope, will come through listening to each other. So if you're interested in the future of women flourishing in the church, then listen along, and if you can, join in the discussion. Well, hello and welcome to the She Needs podcast. Along with my co-host Dave Bish, I'm delighted to have Aimee Byrd with us today. Aimee, really warm welcome to this podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I think it's a great idea that you are continuing the conversation after reading She Needs. So I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thanks, Aimee. So Aimee is an author of many excellent books that have really influenced the church and many people, including myself. I am deeply grateful to you, Aimee. She's been a blogger, a podcast co-host, a theologian, and the rest. And we're just so delighted to have you with us today. It was a few years ago that I met you. We read your book, Why Can't We Be Friends, as part of the Passion for Evangelism book club. And I was so impacted by that book. Today, we're going to be thinking about friendships between men and women, and in particular, thinking about the She Needs Brothers chapter. I grew up with two brothers. I loved canoeing and cycling and scouts and outdoor sports. And most of my teenage and university years were spent with boys and men, and I had no problem relating to them. But in the last 20 years, as I look back, I've seen an increasing segregation between men and women in the church circles that I'm part of. And so, Aimee, I'm really grateful for your book. So, first of all, maybe you could just share with us a bit about the book and why you wrote Why Can't We Be Friends?
Sure. I had similar upbringing as you. I have a brother I grew up with, and my dad taught martial arts. So, that was a very co-ed thing. I felt like, we had a very like physically active family. But also like spiritually and intellectually, like I never grew up feeling like there was any kind of weirdness or difference between the sexes there. And it wasn't until I became older in the church, as a young adult, finding our own church when my husband and I got married. Um, and particularly when I began wanting to learn more as a woman in the church about God, that I started realizing that the differences and the different messages really given to women in the church. And that's how I really became an author, was just trying to write into this lonely space as a thinking woman in the church. And as my writing gained some popularity, I get invited on these speaking engagements, and I'm, doing this podcasting and things like that. Then I really start getting these messages even more. And in talking to other women who, are in seminary, but their professor won't do the office hours with them because, the Billy Graham rule or something like that. And women in church who are in ministry positions who, don't get invited to the things with the men. And, even women who are in Christian parachurch ministries who, you might do like a business lunch type thing to do a meeting, but all of a sudden they're treated oddly for even bringing that up. And I decided to write this book because really I knew it was going to cause controversy, which is so sad. But I decided to write this book when I found myself at my limit. I was at a dinner in downtown Philadelphia. It was night. I had trouble finding a parking space, so I had to park like several blocks down. And it was men and women at this dinner. There were some wives and husbands there. And I was traveling. I did not have my husband, and several people did not have their spouse. And as we're kind of breaking up to leave at the end of dinner, we're going out different doors. And I walked out the back entrance and with two male friends that I had. And at this point, it's dark outside and it's raining. And I was going to have to walk down several alleys to get to my car. And not only like neither of them offered me a ride to my car. And one of them offered me his umbrella to borrow. And, part of me was like, no, I'm not going to let you feel good about giving me an umbrella, when you don't care about my safety. And so I didn't give him that satisfaction really. And so I find myself walking at night in the city in a dangerous area in the rain, thinking my husband would be so mad right now if he knew this was what I was doing, all because of appearances, really. Neither of these men wanted anyone to see me in their car with them alone. And so this whole message of kind of like male benevolence and chivalry, really, and protection of the woman was just shown to be a farce to me, that it's really about protection of their quote unquote ministries. And so the message that it sent to me was so devaluing. And at that point, I'm like, why? My husband teaches elementary school, so he works with a lot of women. So this is kind of in the secular world, this isn't a problem. Of course, there's things you got to work through and talk as husband and wife and decide how you're going to handle different situations. But that's just part of growing up and loving people well. So I almost felt like, I guess I want to write a book that just gives like theological common sense to what we should already know, how to love one another well. And so I
It's
wrote, Why Can't We Be Friends?
Well, thank you for writing it. It's shocking and sad why you had to write it, but we're grateful that you did write it.
Thank you. Yeah. And the first half of the book is, I kind of look at the reasons why it's not working out so well for men and women in the church. Like, why can't we be friends? And that we don't view one another holistically, that we are immature, that we're being led by our fears, things like this, that we don't regard one another as brother and sister. And then in the second half of the book, I try to kind of do the flip side of that, and how are we to view one another? How are we to value one another? And how are we to practice sibling friendship between the sexes in the church?
It's so striking reading the book. I loved reading it. It's just thank you so much for writing it. And early on, you talk about how we've lost the beauty of brotherhood and sisterhood, and then get into kind of, um, yeah, I guess kind of why we might have got to that situation. And I was so struck by the way that you talked about how we view each other as a threat to each other. And I guess that's the story you're telling of going to the car as well, isn't it? It's
Right.
not just that we've lost the good thing and gone to
Mm-hmm.
car. It doesn't really matter, but we've sunk down to this sense of we're actually really dangerous to each other. I wonder if you could say a bit more about like how do we get there? How did that?
Yeah.
Where's that come
Well,
from?
that is the message that a lot of women feel in the church. And in one way that we've gotten there that is more like pop culture that I think has just gone crazy is there's the Billy Graham rule. And it's kind of when I say pop culture because some of it kind of stems from when Harry met Sally kind of thinking, from this popular movie from a long time ago where um, Harry tells Sally that no, men and women can never be friends because the sex part always gets in the way. And that thinking is kind of extended into what has become of the Billy Graham rule in the church. The history of that rule really is more, Billy Graham traveled a lot. He was away from home more than he was home. And him and another ministry leader decided that they were going to put some boundaries to the way they interacted with women to curtail any kind of temptation. And, that he's a model to all these people too. And I can understand that on one level. I'm not saying, hey, throw out any boundaries that you would have, throw out any discernment that you would want to have. And certainly not everybody is able, you're not able to be friends with every person. You have to have discernment. Or what friendship might look like with that person would be very different than another person. Some people are more safe than others. Some people are more mature than others. Um, and I don't want to just like fault Billy Graham because I feel like people took that and ran with it into like first it's like all ministry leaders need to adapt this rule. Even like Vice President Pence adapted this rule. And so they're not going to, you know, eat with a woman or ride in a car with a woman or travel or, you know, these different things. And so then, yeah, then women start looking like threats to these people's marriages and also threats to their ministries, which is just a horrible message. And as valuable and wonderful as a marriage is, and as valuable and wonderful as a ministry is, it's actually not the most valuable thing. And that's something I tried to discern in the book, is that, you know, the most valuable thing is our relationship with God. And if we are moving towards eternal communion with the triune God and one another in Christ, then that's where we should be. That should be our fountainhead, right? That should be our goal and our vision for then how we are going to view and treat and practice that with one another. And so, yeah, women are much more than our bodies and much more than, you know, I think worth working through any disoriented desires and things like that. Like, we're called to grow. We're called to relational growth, not staying stagnant in these immature areas.
No, absolutely. And I love the way that in the book you talk about that, and you're like, it's not like you're saying let's be reckless or anything, but you're taking that really seriously as well. And but then we're missing out, aren't we? So you talk
Right.
about how we're called to intimate sibling communion with each other. It's not just, oh, we avoid this trouble, but there's all this benefit to gain from friendship with each other. Can you say more about that?
Yes, exactly. I mean, Paul tells us in Romans 12, I believe, to love one another deeply as brothers and sisters. And this isn't just like a one-off verse. There's been some great scholarship done that I am kind of footnoting and sourcing from in the book on, like, this is the metaphor and status that Paul uses to address the church more than anything else, even more than calling it the church, more than calling it the Christ's body. He addresses believers, I think over 100 times, as brothers and sisters. And you know, I did some research and looking into like what that might mean to the original readers, even because ancient siblingship was so valuable. Like, betraying a brother or a sister was looked at as worse than, you know, betraying a marriage. So this was a very strong bond at that time, and it had like certain honors and responsibilities attached to it. So when Paul is saying this, he is calling us to unity and harmony, and distinction without reduction. And so they knew then, you know, how to value and how to treat a sibling. And we still know that ourselves. You know, when he tells Timothy, as a young pastor, to treat the older women as mothers and to treat the younger women as sisters, man, I just think that defines it right there, right? It's not an avoidance. Um, Purity is something we should value in the church very much, but purity is way more than like not having an affair. Purity is a positive virtue. And so I think this is an intimacy that we're even called to, that that advocates for the holiness of our brothers and sisters in the church.
So good, isn't it?
Mhm.
Such a good vision of how it can be. I don't know. I'm helping pastor a church, and like we're pretty evenly men and women, I guess. Like, I suppose many
Okay.
churches are pretty roughly I suppose either the same number of men and women, or even more women in some cases,
Right.
because
Yeah, definitely.
hopefully church is a safe place in the world for women to be in. And yet without this, like, how do I pastor half the church if I've got this
Right.
suspicion and fear? And I guess it comes from both sides, doesn't it? We're all instilled with this kind of sense. Have you seen it done well? What are the things that help?
In my own experiences, in some ways it's been done well, in some ways it hasn't. And, depending on what kind of church you're at too, whether they uphold like a complementarian view where women aren't to be in like ministerial positions as a pastor or an elder, or whether an egalitarian church. Because I will say that right now I'm at an egalitarian church and the pastor is a woman. And I do see how differently, not only how much safer I feel like as a non-threat in that church, but and how I see like there's so many couples in that church that have been married for over 50 years. And I just see how interchangeable the sexes are in different services in the church, which is just beautiful, but it's not interchangeable in a way that is the same. And the pastor models this in such a beautiful way. I wrote an article about it, and it's in my book that comes out next year, is that her femininity, like in so many egalitarian churches as well, they'll say, yeah, sure, women can do all these same things. But the invitation is kind of like, just do it like us, though, like as a man does it, you can do it. And when we first started visiting this church, the pastor was on maternity leave. She's young, she's in her mid-30s. And I thought, wow, this is very interesting. I'm kind of interested to see how the church runs without her. And then what this looks like with a pastor with young children who's a woman. And sure enough, the church was running just fine without her, which I found very interesting that, okay, there's a maturity involved in the congregation, but also in the leader, and that, she isn't this hierarchical, like have to control everything. And then when she first came back on her first day, returning as the preacher from maternity leave, I walk into the service and she's got like her baby strapped on to her chest. I thought, oh, how cute that is, and wonder when she's going to take that off, before she does her job. And I end up watching a woman lead an entire service and preach a sermon with a baby attached to her chest. And it was one of the most powerful, beautiful things I'd ever seen, because, a lot of times with male preachers, it's these women take the kids for us and get them out of the way so that we can do this important thing of delivering God's word and ministering. And this looked very different from that. This was choice. She did this by choice. And it was feminine and beautiful. And it was a wonderful invitational sermon as well. Like, it didn't distract from the word that she gave us. So I do think like here's a picture of not just saying, well, it's okay, sure, you can lead this church, or sure, you can preach, or sure, we can interact and be friends. But it was like, no, like you're valuable in your distinction too. And I think that's so important.
Thanks, Aimee. That's a great example. It's so helpful to hear your perspective on that. One of the reasons you're popular over here, UK and in the US, is because you're frank and you acknowledge the pains and the problems within the church. And I'm one that's grateful for that. I think I tweeted this morning that, acknowledging your story brings hope, and telling your story brings hope. But a question I've got is, how do you stop becoming cynical? And how do you forgive, move on, and continue to believe in what God is doing through the church? So I'm loving your new book, Hope in the Scars. It's been really good for me. But yeah, I've been impressed by your book because it's brought me so much hope. But just wondered if you could share a bit here about that.
Right. That is a struggle. I went through a pretty significant amount of spiritual abuse, and it was public in the church. And people that I thought were my friends, even my denomination, and elders in it and leaders in it, that I thought, I trusted, turned on me. So in many, different ways, whether it was neglect or harassment or betrayal in other forms. And so, yeah, it can be really easy to be cynical. And still like somebody, who I looked up to and in some ways was mentored by. I just saw another that was involved in scandal in the church. So it is hard to not be cynical. But one thing, maybe I can paraphrase something that Walter Brueggemann said, is that the present is both darker and much more glorious than we see it. So those things are together. It's a lot darker than we think it is even. So and on that end, sure, we can go down that cynical hole and be like, oh man, you think this is bad, but there is way more, way more. But on the other side, like we miss the glory so much. We miss the beauty that we're being invited into that is all over the place. We miss the resurrections that are happening. And, I work from this verse in John 12:24 in the Hope in Our Scars, where Jesus is saying that unless you're like this grain of wheat that falls to the earth and dies, you remain alone. But if you die, you bear much fruit. And I think, man, there's a lot that we need to die to that we just don't want to. And a verse like that can be weaponized, can be weaponized with someone in power to keep people oppressed. But when you're the one being oppressed, and you're really reading the verse for the mystery of what it is, there are things that these people can't take from you, but there's this struggle before the Lord. Like, I had to struggle with like my reputation I'm being completely slandered and plotted against publicly. And not only is that like my personal life that I'm worried about what people think about me, my own children are seeing, me be called like the great whore of Babylon online by the church. But also my vocation, like as a writer, this is going to affect, taint and stain me as a writer. And, we should want a good reputation in a lot of ways. We want to be good witnesses to God. We should care about that. But, in struggling with the Lord, I'm like, that's not the most important thing though. I can't control my reputation. But I can evaluate and work on my character. And that's more important, right? So down to the ground, the reputation part had to go, it'd be like, I'm not going to sink to the level of these people, hopefully, just for my reputation. And I'm just going to have to put that in the ground and see what Christ will do with that. And it's amazing because in some ways, there's things that you die to that you valued, maybe it's the number of people who liked you, or maybe it's just comfort and belonging in a church, even in a community. But, and just feeling like you can walk in a room and not wonder what people are thinking about you, and particularly a church, and worry about what people are thinking about you. But there's things that you learn that are much more valuable that resurrect out of that. And the cool thing too is, the warning there is unless you do this, you remain alone. And if you do this, you bear much fruit. And Malcolm Guy writes a poem and that's kind of like a prayer on this verse. And he's praying that, that I could be like this grain of wheat that falls to the earth and the underground and dies. And he calls it the crowded underground where the other fall and gather. And that's just it. Like, you're not alone. Like, you're clobbered down there on the underground, and you look to the left and you look to the right and you're like, oh, it's crowded down here. You find your people. And I think that's where church should be hanging out. That's where our stories come out. That's where we can hold them together. And you look at our wounds, they're an act of hope to name them, because that this is not the way it's supposed to be. Something's wrong. There's something else that's much more glorious. And we can do that together and stay in the room with one another.
Aimee, thank you so much. You not only have experienced some awful things, you, in the midst of it, bring others hope. I'm not
I
quite
hope
sure
so.
how you do. No, you definitely do. You do for me. So, my final question today, is what do you think she needs in
Mm.
order to flourish in the church?
I think she needs the leaders in the church to lead the way in looking at her and everyone in the church through Christ's eyes. I think that's just such a vision of that will help us constantly, because there are going to be struggles. There's going to be personality clashes. There's going to be stereotypes that we need to learn that we might not even realize we're holding on to. There's going to be cultural differences. So if we keep that before us, I think that that's just such a helpful way of valuing. She needs her value received. She needs to be thought of as a gift, not a threat. And so if you're looking at her through the eyes of Christ, you're definitely going to see her as a gift because of what Christ did for her, right? Christ died for his bride, which is very interesting that it's this feminine language that is used for the church. So that value is there. So yeah, I would say that she needs to be looked at with the value of being looked at through Christ's eyes. And then you're going to see as well that she's a distinct person too. She's not just in this category of woman or whatever the other things that, of her demographic, but that she is a unique and distinct person, made in the image of God, and also a gift to the church.
Aimee, thanks so much for joining us today. I could spend the whole afternoon asking you questions, but we don't have any more time. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. Please do read Aimee's books, and in particular the one that we've been talking about today, Why Can't We Be Friends? Avoidance is Not Purity. Thank you, Aimee. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for your work, Nay. I love your book, and I hope that it's widely read.
Thanks so much, Aimee.